What would your younger self say about how your family turned out?
Do you know your true worth? I learned mine the night my own sister sent me a message that read, word for word, "It's just for the successful ones," and with that one line, she made it very clear that I was not welcome at the family dinner. I stared at my phone for a while, not because I did not understand what she meant, but because it summed up years of quiet judgment, of side comments about me not being married, not having children, not posting vacation photos in some resort, and apparently not being good enough to sit down at a table in my parents' house where the so-called real achievers were gathered to toast each other. I could have fired back something sharp, but instead I did the one thing I had trained myself to do after years of being written off. I kept the evidence, I took a screenshot, and I ordered takeout. I remember opening the container of noodles and thinking that this was not the worst way to spend an evening, because at least I did not have to endure Lauren's husband lecturing me about how he manages client portfolios, or my mother asking if maybe I was too focused on work to notice the important things in life. Still, it burned. Not because I needed their food or their table, but because my own family thought it was acceptable to rank people and decide who counted. My brother-in-law, Grant, had once joked that family reunions were like LinkedIn with casseroles, and apparently he meant it. The irony was that for the last 6 months, I had been working nights and weekends on something none of them even had the faintest idea about. I had been negotiating a deal that was larger than anything my family could even picture, the kind of deal that makes headlines in financial publications, the kind of deal where every comma in the contract mattered because a single slip could mean millions lost. And the truth is, it was brutal. I was on calls until midnight, I was rewriting contracts at 2 in the morning, and I was keeping a whole team afloat when they were scared about insurance renewals and rent. Nothing about it was glamorous. But it was real. That night, while I sat on my couch with my takeout, the embargo on the transaction lifted. The local news ran a segment about the deal. Our company had just closed an acquisition valued at $120 million, and there I was on screen, shaking hands. Smiling that exhausted but relieved smile of someone who had just survived months of nonstop pressure. My inbox lit up within minutes. Emails from people I had not spoken to in years, LinkedIn requests, even texts from old coworkers. I did not respond to any of them right away, because I wanted to sit in the moment, just me and the knowledge that the scoreboard my family used did not matter anymore. The next morning, my phone nearly exploded. Missed calls, voicemails, group chat pings, relatives I had not seen since college suddenly acting like they wanted to catch up. My mother called sounding cheerful, as though the previous night's exclusion had never happened, asking me if I had eaten well and saying how proud she was to see me on television. My father, who usually kept silent, asked if the amount was real, if the number was truly what the anchor had said. And then there was Lauren, who suddenly wanted to clarify that the dinner was more of a networking thing and not meant to hurt me, as if those exact words she had typed had been anything but intentional. I muted the family group chat without responding. I changed my phone settings so that unknown numbers went straight to voicemail. I forwarded the text from Lauren to my own email with the subject line "Keep," because I knew that at some point, that message would matter. It was not about holding a grudge. It was about keeping a record, the way you do when you know the story is far from over. By that morning, every single relative wanted to be associated with me. Suddenly, I was not the sister who was too busy for a family. I was the person they all wanted in photos, the cousin they wanted to brag about, the daughter they wanted to parade in front of neighbors. But inside I felt no urge to rush and answer them. For the first time, I realized that I had the power to decide who got a chair at my table and who would be left standing. And that was the moment the whole thing shifted, because while they were scrambling to claim me as one of the successful ones, I was already planning how to remind them exactly what they had written to me the night before. The real game was just beginning. The next morning began in the most absurd way possible, with my phone vibrating so relentlessly on the nightstand that I thought something catastrophic must have happened. Yet when I finally forced myself to look at the screen through eyes still heavy from too little sleep, it was nothing more than an avalanche of missed calls, voicemails, text messages, and group chat notifications, all coming from the very people who had decided, less than 24 hours earlier, that I did not deserve a place at a dinner table reserved for the so-called successful ones. There was something almost comical about the sheer volume of their sudden interest, as though an entire family had woken up and realized they had made a monumental mistake and were now trying, in a panic, to erase the evidence of their own arrogance by drowning me in forced enthusiasm and belated pride. My mother's name showed up 3 times in the call log, and when I finally listened to one of her voicemails, her tone was so sugary and rehearsed that it made my teeth ache. She was gushing about how wonderful it had been to see me on the news, slipping in a comment about how we always knew you were destined for something great, conveniently ignoring the fact that not even a full day earlier she had allowed a dinner to proceed under a banner of exclusion that she had not only accepted but quietly endorsed. My father's approach was different, though not less irritating, because rather than pretending nothing had happened, he focused entirely on the figure he had heard the anchor say aloud, repeating in his voicemail, "Was it really 120 million? Did they say that correctly? Is it true?" As if the only measure of my worth was a number on a screen, as if all the late nights, the months of unpaid effort, the years of building brick by brick were invisible unless validated by a headline that could be quantified, packaged, and bragged about to friends at his golf club. Then there was Lauren, my sister, who had clearly decided that her best strategy was to gaslight the entire situation by claiming in her text that the dinner was logistics only, some kind of narrowly tailored event where attendance had to be limited, and that her message had been misinterpreted, even though the words she had typed had been as clear and deliberate as a slap to the face. Her husband, Grant, chimed in shortly afterward with a nauseatingly corporate message about how he and I should synergize and collaborate, hinting at introductions to his clients, which I knew was code for "let me leverage your visibility to increase my own standing." It would have been easy, almost natural, to respond with anger, to finally unleash the years of pent-up resentment I had accumulated from constantly being the relative who was different, who was treated as though my work only counted if it fit into the neat boxes of family approval, but instead I made a different choice, one that surprised even me, because rather than waste my energy in explanations or confrontations, I quietly decided to set rules. I sat at my kitchen table, opened the family group chat that had been buzzing like a swarm of bees, and typed out a message that was deliberately calm, deliberately cold, and deliberately final. I wrote that from now on, all requests for money, connections, introductions, or favors would not be entertained, that any attempt to pull me into gossip or status games would be ignored, and that if they wished to speak to me, they would need to do so with respect and without expectation. I told them, in words that could not be misread, that I had nothing to give them other than conversation if they chose to treat me like a person, not a resource. I hit send, muted the chat, and placed my phone face down on the table. For the first time, I felt something shift inside me, not just because I had set boundaries with my family, which I had tried and failed to do for years, but because I realized how much power came from refusing to play the game at all. I did not owe them explanations, I did not owe them apologies, and I certainly did not owe them access to something they had dismissed as worthless until the moment it appeared on television. The irony, of course, was that while they had spent years measuring success by wedding photos, home values, and social media likes, the thing they had told me did not count had suddenly become the very currency they were desperate to spend. That morning, while my phone continued to buzz with messages I refused to read, I thought about how different the definitions of success could be depending on who was doing the measuring, and I decided that from now on, I would be the one holding the ruler. It was not about shutting my family out entirely, though I was tempted, but about making it clear that they would never again get to dictate the terms of my value. As I closed my laptop after a meeting with my co-founder, who congratulated me without a trace of envy or agenda, I laughed quietly to myself, because I knew that my sister would not take this boundary well, and that she would almost certainly escalate in some desperate attempt to reassert control. And I was right, because just as I was beginning to enjoy the silence I had created, a notification popped up that showed Lauren had gone public. She had not been able to resist. Lauren could not sit with the silence for long, because for someone like her, being ignored was the worst insult imaginable, and instead of letting my message in the family chat settle or considering that maybe, just maybe, I was serious about drawing lines, she did exactly what I knew she would do, which was to escalate the situation by making it public. She posted a picture on social media, one of those carefully curated images that she and Grant always seem to have on standby, the kind where the lighting is perfect and the wine glasses are staged just so. And in the caption, she wrote something that was both vague and venomous at the same time. Some people forget where they came from once the cameras show up, but family never forgets. It was a transparent dig at me, and she knew her audience well enough to understand that half the extended relatives and neighborhood acquaintances would nod in agreement without having a clue about what actually happened. When a cousin forwarded me the screenshot, I did not even feel anger so much as a kind of weary recognition, because this was exactly how Lauren operated. She wrapped her pettiness in the language of virtue, made it seem like she was defending family values, when in reality she was simply furious that her attempt to exclude me had backfired in the most spectacular way possible. The difference this time was that I was not playing defense anymore. I had learned, in the hardest way, that silence without structure just invites more abuse, so instead of stewing or drafting a long emotional response, I picked up the phone and called Nina, my friend who also happened to be an attorney with a ruthless eye for boundaries. I explained the situation, I forwarded her the screenshots, and I asked a simple question: what is the cleanest way to make this stop without dragging myself into a war that would drain me? Nina, who knew my family history almost as well as I did, suggested something that made me laugh at first, but then struck me as absolutely right. She told me to put my boundaries into writing the same way I would for a business arrangement, to make them so explicit and professional that anyone who tried to cross them would look ridiculous. With her help, I drafted what we half-jokingly called a policy of personal boundaries, a document that was not legally binding in the traditional sense, but was written with enough formal language and clear consequences that it carried the weight of authority. It included the screenshots of Lauren's text disinviting me from the dinner, the screenshot of her public post, and a straightforward notice that any further attempts to harass me, shame me, or publicly misrepresent me would be documented and, if necessary, handled through formal channels. I sent the document privately to my parents, to Lauren, to Grant, and to the family group chat, not with malice, but with the same calm professionalism I would use to circulate minutes after a tense board meeting. Predictably, my mother called within minutes, her voice trembling as she said I was going too far, that family should not need policies to govern interactions, and that by putting things into writing I was making everything colder than it needed to be. I listened politely and then told her that if family had respected boundaries in the first place, I would not have needed to write anything down, but since history had proven otherwise, this was the only language people seemed to understand. My father, to his credit, stayed quiet, though I could hear him in the background muttering that maybe it's not such a bad idea. Lauren, on the other hand, reacted exactly as Nina and I expected. She went silent for 2 days, which in her world was equivalent to a scream, because silence meant she was plotting. Then she texted me directly, something she had not done in weeks, asking if we could meet for coffee to clear the air. I stared at that message for a long moment, knowing full well that coffee was not about clearing anything, but about attempting to reframe the narrative on her terms, yet I said yes, because sometimes the smartest move is to let the other person show their hand in plain sight. What mattered most to me in that moment was not the coffee or the conversation, but the fact that, for the first time in years, I felt no fear about walking into a room with her. I knew I had the receipts, I knew I had the structure, and I knew that whatever game she thought she was playing, the rules had already changed. The family could gossip, the neighbors could speculate, and Lauren could post all the cryptic captions she wanted, but I had drawn the line in ink, and everyone had seen it. And as I set down my phone after replying to her, I could not help but smile, because I realized that by asking me to coffee, Lauren had admitted something she would never say out loud, that for the first time, she needed me to play along. And she had no idea that I was already preparing the next move. When I walked into the coffee place Lauren chose, a sleek little spot that she liked because the staff knew her by name and the tables were close enough together that anyone could catch fragments of a performance if one happened, I had already decided that I would not give her the satisfaction of a back and forth that spiraled into the same old pattern where she declared herself the curator of what counts, and I defended myself like some applicant begging for a place at a table I no longer cared about. So I sat down, ordered something simple, and waited while she launched into a monologue that was all spin and no ownership, the kind of speech that starts with "I think there was a misunderstanding," and slides quickly into a rebranding effort in which the exclusionary dinner becomes a niche professional gathering. The text that said, "It's just for the successful ones," becomes poor phrasing, and her public post about people forgetting where they came from is suddenly a general thought on humility that had nothing to do with me, even though we both knew it had everything to do with me. She kept pausing to see if I would jump in and save her from the weight of her own words, and when I did not, she tried a different angle, wondering aloud if we could show a united front and turn the page, which, translated into plain language, meant she wanted me to agree that none of this happened so she could pretend she had never thrown the first punch, and I let her talk because listening costs me nothing. But when she finally stopped to breathe, I told her, as evenly as I could, that I was not interested in edits, that what I cared about was behavior, and that going forward my version of family would be the people who could sit in truth without turning it into a public relations exercise. She blinked like I had spoken a language she did not recognize, then pivoted into numbers, asking careful, probing questions about the deal that she tried to frame as curiosity, but that carried the contour of a pitch. Because within a minute she was exploring the idea of a family brand, something tasteful and upscale that could feature the Brooks legacy and leverage this momentum, and I could almost hear Grant in those phrases, the way he trains nouns to walk around in expensive suits, while they try to get at the same thing every time, which is access to whatever you have that can make them look bigger by standing next to it. I told her I could not disclose anything that was not public, that I would not introduce her to anyone in my network, and that I did not recommend she build a business on the back of a caption strategy. And when she laughed like I was being difficult rather than responsible, I reminded her of something she had conveniently erased from the family narrative, which was that earlier in the year, when a relative had been stuck with a medical deductible that would have knocked them into debt, I had paid it quietly and asked for nothing, and that the only comment she had offered back then was a lecture about how I was enabling, and I watched her face do that small flinch it always does when the timeline refuses to cooperate with the image she is trying to sell. What I said next was not planned until it came out of my mouth, but it landed with the kind of clean finality I had been craving for years, because rather than argue about definitions of success or beg her to admit the text was cruel, I laid out a new structure that would make all those soft, slippery conversations unnecessary, and I told her that the following weekend I would be hosting an open office day at a neutral co-working space, where any family member who had an idea could book a slot. Bring basic numbers and talk to me about feasibility, not feelings, that I would consider micro-backing for ideas that were coherent and accountable, that no introductions would be made to my contacts, that no inside information would be shared, and that any attempt to turn the event into a status parade would be grounds for immediate removal. And she looked at me like I had just announced a pop quiz in a room full of people who preferred extra credit, because this plan replaced gossip with a scoreboard and left no room for vague claims about destiny or vibes. She tried to scoff, calling it a little formal for family, and I told her evenly that informality had been the cover for a lot of disrespect, that clarity is not cold when it protects everyone, and that I was done using warmth as an alibi for bad behavior. For a moment she backed off the pitch and attempted sisterhood, softening her voice and asking whether I wanted to heal the rift, whether I could see that a public success had changed the way people saw me, and that I might use that shift to bring everyone up. And I answered that bringing people up is not the same as letting them climb on your shoulders, that the first requires effort and boundaries while the second requires you to pretend you never had a spine, and she stared at me over the rim of her cup with the practiced neutrality of someone who has been told that stillness reads as control, then made the smallest mistake, which was to ask whether there would be exceptions for family leaders. A phrase that gave the game away because it meant she expected to be graded on a curve, and I told her, without raising my voice, that there would be no exceptions, that if she wanted backing she would bring a real plan with real numbers and answer real questions, and that if she wanted respect she could start by respecting the words she had already said out loud. I left the coffee shop feeling lighter than I had in years, not because I had won anything yet, but because I had managed to stay on script when my old reflex would have dragged me back into a loop of defending my worth to someone who had already decided what I was allowed to be. And as I walked to my car, I thought about how adult it felt to make a rule and stand next to it without shouting. Later that afternoon, I sent a short, neutral message to the family chat with the open office details, time slots, submission form, and a single paragraph about conduct that made two things clear: that no one would be shamed in that room, and that attempts to shame others outside of it would disqualify the offender for a full year from anything I funded. And as the replies began to trickle in, a mix of enthusiasm, skepticism, and the thinly veiled hostility that always arrives when people realize the old pecking order has lost its legs, I felt a steady calm that told me I had landed on something that could not be argued with because it did not depend on feelings. That calm lasted until the evening, when I saw Lauren step outside the frame and make the move I had expected but still resented, because within minutes of our coffee she had placed a call, not to me and not to our parents, but to someone who has always treated family like a stage with assigned seats and microphones, and when that person reached out with a message that managed to be both sweet and coercive at the same time, I realized the weekend was going to be louder than I had planned, and the only thing left to decide was whether I would let the noise change the rules or whether I would do what I promised and keep the scoreboard clean. The co-working space I rented for the open office day did not have any glamour to it, and that was exactly the point, because I wanted a place without staged lighting or family memorabilia where ideas would have to survive on substance rather than nostalgia. So I set out a simple sign-in sheet, printed the same one-page rubric for everyone, and told the front desk to send people in on their slot, and as those first relatives drifted through the door with notebooks that looked more like props than tools, I felt a strange mix of tenderness and resolve. Tenderness, because I know what it is to want something and not have the language for it yet, and resolve, because I was not going to let this devolve into a sympathy drive dressed up as entrepreneurship. Which is why I began each conversation with the same calm question that left no room for fantasy, asking what problem they were solving, for whom, at what price, with what margin, and how they planned to reach a customer who did not share their last name. The first cousin talked about a subscription box that sounded suspiciously like a habit they were hoping to monetize without running the math, so I asked about shipping costs and churn and watched the idea deflate in slow motion when faced with arithmetic. An aunt who had always been generous with advice, but thin on accountability, pitched a catered event sideline that would have been viable if it had been priced for anything other than vanity, and when I gently pressed on hourly labor and food waste, she admitted that she had never actually calculated either, and I nodded because the truth is that most people love the front door of a dream and avoid the back door where the invoices live. Between sessions I took a breath, checked the time, and prepared myself for the person I knew would treat this as a stage rather than a meeting, and right on cue Lauren appeared with Grant at her shoulder, carrying a glossy deck that would have been at home in a conference room where buzzwords pass for oxygen, and before I could even ask my first question, she launched into a pitch for a family lifestyle brand that would celebrate heritage, complete with a calendar of curated gatherings, a line of products stamped with our last name, and a membership tier that sounded less like community and more like a velvet rope, which might have impressed someone who confuses a logo with a business, but did not get past me because I had heard a version of this pitch for years, usually over dessert and always tied to the idea that our family could be a product if only the skeptical members would stop asking about costs. I let her talk for a respectful stretch of minutes, then set the deck down and asked quietly about margins, about customer acquisition beyond our friends, about liability insurance for events that served alcohol, and about what value the brand would deliver that people could not get for free by simply hosting their loved ones without monetizing the evening. She flinched at the word liability, glanced at Grant as if he could rescue the momentum, and said something about partnerships and influencer alignment, so I asked for the names and the signed letters of intent, and when there were none, she tried to pivot to the story of legacy, which is usually where these conversations end because guilt is cheaper than modeling, except this time I did not allow legacy to end the math. And I told her that if she wanted family to stand behind something, she would need real numbers or real humility, and that either would be acceptable, but neither would be faked in this room. What I did then had been sitting in my chest for a week, gathering weight until it became impossible to ignore, and it was not a gotcha moment or an ambush, but a choice to change the rules in a way that would outlast the adrenaline of any single day. Because I reached into my bag and pulled out a stack of folders that held a simple framework for a small, legally clean opportunity fund I had set up, not a vanity pot and not a slush pool for family drama, but a modest, transparent vehicle with an application process, quarterly reviews, and a code of conduct that made two things non-negotiable: that gossip and shaming would lead to a year-long suspension from access, and that access would never again be decided by wedding photos, house size, or who could project confidence over coffee. I explained in the same even tone I use in rooms where the stakes are higher than hurt feelings that the fund would back skill building, licensing fees, and implementation for tiny, testable projects with real learning baked in, that I would not be the committee, that two outside advisors would score applications blindly, and that the only way into the room would be through the door everyone could see. There was a silence I have only heard a few times in my life, the kind that tells you a wall has just moved, and before anyone could turn that silence into noise, I announced the first two microgrants. One to a cousin who had been quietly retraining after a layoff and had spreadsheets that would make a finance team proud, and one to a niece who wanted to pilot a tutoring service for kids who could not pay private rates and who had already run a small trial in her church basement just to see what would break. And when I said their names, I watched relief spread through their faces in a way that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with the fact that someone had finally treated their effort like it belonged in the light. I could feel the room start to teeter toward a debate about favoritism or symbolism, and I refused to let it tip that way, which is why I reached for the final piece that had been waiting on the table behind me. A simple wooden chair that I had placed there that morning, because I knew I would need something you could point at when the air got crowded with excuses, and I slid it forward and told everyone that this chair was the only seat that mattered to me, that it was reserved for whoever showed respect and results regardless of last name or optics, that the chair did not ask for photographs and did not care for curated captions, and that from today on anyone who wanted time, money, or access from me would have to earn it by sitting there under the same questions everyone else faced, which meant that titles and followers and marriage certificates would not be accepted as currency. Then, because the truth loses power when you mumble it, I took out my phone, opened the screenshot of Lauren's message, read aloud the line about the dinner being just for the successful ones, and set my phone next to the chair without raising my voice or looking for a reaction. And the room let out a very soft sound that happens when denial meets evidence it cannot outrun. Lauren stood up with the tight little smile she uses when she is deciding whether to cry or to double down, said something about me making a spectacle, and left without waiting for anyone to follow. Grant trailing after her with the deck he had planned to wave like a flag, and for a few minutes there were awkward movements and rustling papers and nervous chuckles that people use when they realize the holiday script needs a rewrite. Yet in the middle of that small chaos, my father walked up. Without fanfare, put his hand on the back of the chair and told me, in a voice I had not heard since I was a teenager, that he was proud of the way I had handled this, and that he wished he had learned earlier how to separate love from approval. And then he stepped back and let the room breathe. I did not chase my mother, who hovered near the door with a look that mixed fear and calculation, because I was done managing the optics of other people's feelings, and when the last application had been collected and the last clipboard stacked, I left the chair where it was and locked the room, not as a symbol but as a promise to myself that the days of begging for a seat at other people's tables were over. When I got home that night, I made something simple to eat and let the quiet settle, and although part of me wondered if I had gone too far by reading the message out loud, the larger part of me knew that I had done exactly what needed to be done. Because I had not humiliated anyone, I had not broken any confidences, and I had not played God with money. I had simply held up a mirror and refused to look away first, and the mirror said that success without standards is just noise. While standards without cruelty can feel like love even when they sting. The next day brought a trickle of messages, a few angry, a few grateful, and a few that were strangely polite, which told me the code was already doing its quiet work, and I smiled at the thought that the most radical thing I had done was the simplest, which was to replace gossip with a rule that did not bend, then stand next to it until the room adjusted. I do not know whether Lauren will ever apply, whether pride will keep her outside, or whether she will sit in the chair and answer the questions like everyone else, and I do not need to know, because the victory I wanted was never a headline or a photograph. It was the day I finally stopped auditioning for a family that loved the idea of success more than they loved the truth, and wrote a new script where I did not ask for a chair. I built one, I left it open. And I made sure the sign on it said the only thing that should have mattered all along, which is that respect gets a seat and everything else can stand.